Okay, so on this handout, there's two sections here. The first one is from Dave Chamberlain, one of the instructors at Bear Valley, and it's just a very brief synopsis of the rulers of the time to give you an idea. And it's important as you're studying the Revelation that you understand the political climate. So if you'll, and this is just a little short page, there's not much to it on it, but if you're looking at trying to date the Revelation and then trying to understand the content of it being very symbolic, it's important for us to go back and look at the political environment of that time period. So if you give it an earlier date, then you're starting in the 60s. So Nero, Vespasian, and then Domitian. So you're looking at that time period right there. Those would be the emperors that you would want to look at and look at how their government ruled and look at what was taking place with these governments in relation to Christianity, because the Revelation is dealing with that. So if you can go back and look at the political environment and see that relationship, it'll help you have a better understanding of who it is that John is writing about. So we're not going to go over this, but we do know no matter where you put the date of Revelation, it's the Roman Empire. We know that. Okay? So Domitian is on here, which is typically the date that most people will give it is closer to the 90s rather than to Nero. So we'll go to that point in time. And then we have some information down here on the Lord's Church because they are the recipients of the Revelation. So you have that to go over and kind of something that you can use as you go back and do further study. All right, the second section you have here, which is theories of interpretation. So last week I noted that there are 5 principal theories of interpretation. And in this paper, we went over them here, but I just gave you a brief synopsis of each one. This one goes into greater detail of what each interpretation, the way it's interpreted, should be viewed. And in here, there are negative and positives to each one. So why is this a good way to interpret it? Is it historical, literal? Is it preterist? How are you going to view it? The futurist is the very first one. So as you go through here, you'll see some discussion on how they view the Revelation. And then as you get to the end of each section there, you'll have negative points and you'll have positive points, or positive and negative, to see if they are actually, is that a good way to do it, or is it a bad way to do it? So you have that in there as well. And again, we've covered each one of those points, but this is just in greater detail. I didn't want to take the time to go through every aspect of this. You can have that on hand when you go back and you do your own studies. All right, now we're looking at the place and the date of the Revelation, the place and the date of the Revelation. Haley's commentary says John had been banished to the island of Patmos, 1:9, and then you can see one on the map of the 7 churches. You can see where all this is. That's in his material. This happened according to apostolic tradition during the persecution of Christians under Emperor Domitian around AD 95. The next year, John was released and permitted to return to Ephesus. The use of the past tense, I was on the island of Patmos, may indicate that he saw the visions on Patmos, but wrote the book after his release and his return to Ephesus around AD 96. Others believe that John transcribed the visions immediately while on Patmos in response to Jesus' command to write. So one way or another, he is using past tense, but at times you can be writing in a past tense from a present perspective, saying, I was there. I run into that problem all the time when I'm writing. Rather than using a present tense, I often refer to a past event as was, and I use grammarian, and it's always telling me, people might appreciate it better if you said, and so you got to really work at rewording it. So anyway, but I always look at it that way. If I was, that doesn't necessarily mean it was years ago, right? I was there, but in the Greek it is a past tense verb. So So he either wrote it when he went back to Ephesus or wrote on Patmos.
Well, you could have wrote it knowing that by the time people read it, it would have been past.
A past tense event, yeah. And because if you look at the command to write, then he would have considered doing it right then and there, right? He wrote it right then and there. I don't think it really makes a difference. It's just that's part of what's in the text, so try to understand that. The one thing that is considerable when you're looking at the date is that John, we know that he was banished to Patmos. We know that, and we know when that happened. So that's why you'll have people giving it this later date, because he says he was on Patmos. If you go back and look at the history and what we have historically about him, we can pinpoint when that happened. And so that puts it in the time period of Domitian. Now, whether if he wrote it while he was on the island or when he got off the island, we're still in the 90s, if that's the case. Makes really no difference there. The book claims John wrote it on Patmos. Those are the different aspects or different passages that suggest that. 3 different periods have been suggested for the time of the writing of Revelation. So you either have the time of Nero, 64 to 68, the time of Vespasian, 69 to 79, or the time of Domitian, 81 to 96. That would certainly be the main time periods. And one of the reasons is because the Revelation is written dealing in part with the persecution of Christians. There's a lot of that is in there. There's other things as well, but we're dealing with the church being persecuted. And if you're going back and looking at the wording in the Revelation, it's being done by a world power. Okay, so you're looking at a government that's doing it. The Jews would not fall under that category, so we can't be looking at a Jewish persecution. We know that after AD 70, pretty much all Jewish persecution of the Christians began to trail off, because in AD 70, Jerusalem was destroyed and the Jews were scattered. So any persecution that we have of the Jews of the Christians, was taking place during 40, 50, 60, that time period right there. So it doesn't, and the fact that we're dealing with a government body, a world ruling body, the way the Revelation describes the persecutors, doesn't fit the Jews. So then you're left with the ruling body of the time that the Christians lived under, and that's the Roman Empire. And there's only 2 times that we can find that really show the persecution of Christians to any great degree. Nero's persecution, which was in 60, and then Domitian. Now, Nero's persecution was never a worldwide, so to speak, persecution. It was very localized, mostly Rome. And we've already gone over what he was doing with all that, the burning of Rome and blaming it on the Christians and so forth. So it wasn't where an edict had gone out. The other persecution that really affected the Christians very heavily, and more so, is Domitian's persecution. What you also find when you go back to that hand that I gave you is that Domitian was also requiring that he be worshipped as a god. And the Christians were refusing to do that. And when you go back and you read the Revelation, you're going to see consequences of how this ruling power puts himself up to be a god. And so that's why there's another piece of information that seems to put it towards Domitian, because Nero never did that. Nero, in fact, if I remember correctly, did not say that he was a deity, but I don't believe he held in deity worship until after his death. Like when he died, then he could be seen that way, but up until that point he couldn't. Domitian was on the other hand, Domitian was alive and saying that he was a god and that you should worship him and so forth. The time of Nero was widely accepted in the last century. Philip Schaff, one of the greatest scholars in the last century, argued for the 64-68 date while admitting that historical evidence favored the 81-96. The first Roman persecution of Christians came from Nero, who blamed the burning of Rome on them. There's no firm evidence that Nero's persecution was universal, nor was it because of religion. And when you read the Revelation, that's what you're focusing on. You're focusing on it being a religious persecution. Internal evidence is often cited in favor of this early date. Since the 12 tribes of Israel are mentioned in chapter 7, it's argued that Revelation must have been written before AD 70 when all the tribal records were destroyed. So if we're looking at that point in time, then we're seeing that there were some records available, and them being mentioned, it would seem likely, well, because of that, maybe this is when it took place under the time of Nero. After that, those records were no longer around. John was told to measure the temple before, therefore it is argued that Revelation must have been written before AD 70 when the temple was still standing. Internal evidence. If he's told to measure the temple, then isn't the temple still standing? The problem with that is John is on the Isle of Patmos, and he's not going to go off and measure the temple. He's not leaving to go to the temple. Since Revelation was written in figurative language, we must not take either the tribes or the temple literally. So if we're looking at it from a figurative standpoint, it's very possible that those things that he's been told are used in a figurative way, not a literal way. So that puts some question or some doubt in whether or not he's actually talking about, and using those two as an argument for Nero. Well, the temple's still up and the 12 tribes are still there. I think that's weak standing. It also argued that the beast in 1318 is Nero. And here's one of those crazy things. And let me tell you what, this kind of stuff to me is just useless. It is also argued that the beast in 1318 is Nero, for Neron Kaiser in Hebrew, and that would be Nero, right? Neron Kaiser in Hebrew has its numerical equivalent 666. So if you took the numbers, or the letters, and you put them together, you would come up with this 666. Why would John use Hebrew when writing to Greek-speaking Christians? That would be a question. Now, certainly, it's a universal epistle, and, what's the word I'm thinking about? Apocalyptic literature, thank you. So, I almost said apocrypha. No, it's not that. And so the Jews are going to read it as well, but I think it's kind of thin to argue, and especially this Neron Kaiser thing. To arrive at this, one has to leave out one letter in the Hebrew language as well. So you got to leave one letter out and say, oh, look. And people have done that. I've seen people so many times read between the lines and take these words and try to find a number that's similar, and when they don't exactly get this, but if you just drop this one letter, that's what it adds up to. I'm like, that's like horrible math and English. But others have used Latin or Greek and have come up with Uranthus, Latinos, and Titan. So you got other names here you could use that are equivalent, and why not these individuals? So remember, Revelation is written in figurative language. So when you're looking at the beast, the mark of the beast, this is figurative language. One of the things that you often hear today about that is what about the mark of the beast? You hear it constantly when they're talking about the mark of the beast. Yeah, and you're going to have it stamped on you, and they're going to it's like people used to say Auschwitz because you had the number stamped on you, or then it became your social security number. Now it's going to be a computer chip that's stuck in you, and it's always something else where some literal number stamped on you, and you can't go out and purchase and buy food. And today we're doing that with our money markets. You hear all these crazy debit cards. You can't get food. They're going to take money away, and when money's gone, you're going to have your number, and that's the mark of the beast. And just welcome to Fantasy Island. I don't know. These people just come up with some of the craziest stuff. It's figurative, so keep that in mind when you're trying to figure out what he's talking about there. 6 is one short of the perfect 7. Therefore, it is a symbol for doom or failure. Multiplied by 3 would indicate the certainty of it. So 7 is that perfect number. 6 is failure to reach perfection. You would have 666 times 3 is it's going to happen. So we're talking about a failure of the powers that are causing this. It doesn't have to, and if you go back and you look at how those numbers are used, how they would have used those numbers, and that's the thing you're supposed to do in interpretation. If they had and understood the numbers and what they referenced symbolically, if they knew that, if they knew what 7 meant, if they knew what 3, how they used those numbers, right? And they would use those in their literature in certain ways. You cannot come 2,000 plus years down the road and completely forget about how they looked at those numbers and come up with new interpretations of those things. Because what you're saying is, when it was written, they didn't have a clue of what it was. It took us 2,000 years later to come up with a different understanding to figure it out. When it's like, yeah, but this certainly was applicable to them, right? This was something that they needed to hear, right? And if that's the case, then they would have been using, even though symbolic, they would have been using things that they could have understood. So if you're going to try to translate and interpret this book, then do it with how they viewed those numbers in mind. When you do it that way, then you'll get their understanding of it, not our understanding 2,000 years later with some concocted story. The time of Vespasian, 69 to 79, has been held by very few serious students of Revelation, so it just doesn't seem to fit into it at all. No external evidence supports this date. One passage can be construed in possible support, and that's chapter 17, 9 through 11. 7 kings are mentioned, 5 are fallen, 1 is, and 1 is to come. It is argued that these kings are the emperors of Rome, beginning with Augustus, followed by Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, and Nero. These are the 5 fallen. The one who is was Vespasian, who was then ruling. The one who is not yet come is Titus, who ruled for only 2 years. So if you take that order, you say, oh, look, this falls into line and lines up with it. The beast who is the 8th then would be Domitian. He's the one that comes and causes all the problems. Some things wrong with this view. It omits 3 emperors, Galba, Otho, and Vitellius, who briefly ruled between Nero and Vespasian. So you just conveniently leave those guys out. And they would argue that you would leave them out. Why? Yeah, sure. It's like, I don't know how, the Revelation doesn't give any idea that that's why you should leave them out. You just left them out because it didn't fit, right? If you leave them in there, guess what you don't get to? You don't get to Domitian. You don't get to Vespasian being that one who's ruling it. No, so there is not one shred of evidence that Vespasian ever persecuted the Christians. And it would seem really out of place that this whole thing is written about what is taking place with the Christians and the church, and Vespasian had nothing to do with that. And there's no evidence that he ever had anything to do with it, with any kind of persecution of the Christians. Remember, Revelation is written in figurative language. Even means, 7 means completeness. The 7 kings, therefore, were a symbolic number representing all kings or kingdoms, past, present, and future. They would oppose the kingdom of God. And Haley writes that in his commentary. So again, if you're going back and looking at it, we're not looking at the 7 kingdoms as being, or that number and the kingdoms being literally 7 kings or 7 kingdoms. It's not, it's a number of complete. So all these kingdoms are going to oppose God, but the outcome, and when you look at what we see today, it's always been the case. The church has always been persecuted. The kingdoms of the world are always up against the church because it doesn't align with what the kingdoms want. Now, there may not be the same kind of persecution going on, but these kingdoms are not embracing the church as if it's part of their government. And let me get this clear to you. I hear this so often on the news. What the church has said, and now they're talking about the Pope. Okay, that's not the church. Now, if you want to talk about a ruling religious organization that was part of countries, yeah, you would look at them because they were part of those. But that's not the church. So it doesn't fall into that as well. The most generally accepted date is the reign of Domitian, 81 through 96. Irenaeus in 120 to 202, a disciple of Polycarp, who was a disciple of John, said the revelation for that was seen not very long since, but almost in our day, toward the end of Domitian's reign. So if you've got this guy writing, his time period is 120 to 202, he's sitting at the doorstep of this revelation and close enough to it that he can tell us. I mean, if you go back to 120, so let's go back 30 years, you know. 30 years ago, us sitting here can go back 30 years and talk about some things that were taking place 30 years ago. So I think John or Polycarp would have been, or Irenaeus would do that as well. Domitian was the first Roman emperor to begin a universal and official persecution of the Church of Christ. He required sacrifice to his image as a test of loyalty to him and to the empire. Nero had accepted worship as a god, but had reserved dedication for the period following death. But Domitian demanded he be worshipped as a god during his lifetime. Revelation was written by John from Patmos around AD 95, 96. So in going back and looking at that date, then and what you're going to find in the Revelation, if all things are being interpreted correctly in regards to the powers and what's taking place with the persecution of the church, then the evidence seems to point towards Domitian more than anyone. Now, I have here Titus Flavius Domitianus, but that depends on the date of the writing. So if you see it as earlier, if you're going to interpret that, then I just put that on there because, you know, if you think it was Nero, if you think it fits that, then, and I mean, I don't know if it's really necessary to pinpoint the date, because what matters is what's written in there. I mean, certainly having the date is important because it helps us to understand what the church is going through and what the ruling bodies are doing, and it gives you some insights into the government at the time, the people of the time. But really what is important is you don't want to miss the message over trying to get all hung up on who was the ruler that was doing all this, what was the ruling power. Now, I would say this, though. This is one reason it's important to figure that out, is so that you don't bring it 2,000 years down the road and make it something that is yet to have even happened. If you can pinpoint the ruler of the time, then you're going to keep it within the context of the time. If you look at it where you say, well, we just don't even know what ruler it was, so that means it's yet to come, then you might be looking to some future ruler. All right, audience. It was addressed to the 7 churches of Asia. You find that in chapter 1-4, chapters 2 and 3. These churches had initially been founded as a result of Paul's pioneer work in the area. Since 7 is the number of completeness, it is likely that these 7 churches stood for all churches everywhere. Keep that in mind. Well, just to the 7 churches. And certainly there are some specific things written, and when we read the Revelation, we see about the specifics to each church and say, oh, well, this is very specific to Thyatira, this is specific to Thessalonica, and so on. So, but if you're looking at the number 7 and it means complete, then the idea then is making reference to what has happened to the body, what has happened to the church, and what is taking place. And I wouldn't say that it's not making reference to specific ones, but the 7 churches then could be understood as to all the churches out there, because what is going to happen and what is happening is not going to be local. It's not going to be the church in Jerusalem. It's going to happen to the church, wherever they may be. Domitian's persecution reached out to all these places. Go ahead, Ken.
It was still specific to 7 churches. Right.
Yeah, that's what I said. I said, I'm not saying it's not, but because it does mention certain things about what they were doing. But the 7, and maybe the idea is picking out these 7 in particular, talking about these particular things, and not just saying, but hey, everybody else is really good, but just you 7 churches are bad. The fact that I only picked 7 could be the idea that he's talking to the church universal and making reference to these as examples to that.
I would take it as there was 7 churches that either need to be lauded or taken back. And, he picked out representatives.
Representatives of them, yeah. And using 7 would be along that line, right? He's using as to everybody. These are the ones that we're using, but to everybody out there, keep these things in mind. Because look, don't you do the same thing? When you read about the 7 churches, how often have preachers stood up and preached those books, and talked about the lukewarm church, Thessalonica. Are we a lukewarm body? It's like, well, that's not talking about us. That's talking about Thessalonica. We're going way back. Why? Well, because we see application of what they were doing as possible application to the church in general.
Actually, all the writings, many of the writings were specific, written
Right.
to a specific location, or canon to the rest of the body.
Right.
So this is, if it's seven, whether he's writing to the seven churches or not,
It's still everybody. Yeah, and that's when you're looking at the symbols of the seven. Why is it just seven churches? Well, if you look at the number and the symbolism of numbers, that number is complete, so it would be all, but he's using seven in particular, which certainly is written to them, and these issues he's bringing up are particular to them, right? But this applies to all. By the last quarter of the first century, Asia Minor was the stronghold of Christianity. I don't know where I'm going with that one, but all right. I thought I had something else. All right, let's go to the purpose then. This is Chuck Horner, and this is really when you're going through Revelation, again, don't lose sight of the purpose of what's being said here. So showing the churches that things that must come to pass hereafter. It is to encourage them and assure them amid persecutions of their ultimate victory and the victory of the cause of Christ. Though they are few in number, poor and distressed, yet the mighty forces of evil will not overwhelm them. For Christ has conquered and guarantees their ultimate triumph. Yet they are realistically told that they must suffer, that more persecutions await them, and the Lord demands faithfulness to his will in spite of all the pressure that may come. I think that's really a great way to summarize what he's trying to get across. And that's something that when you're reading the Revelation, rather than getting off into the weeds and trying to figure every little aspect out about it, and then miss the point of what he's trying to say. So, yes, he's going to talk about the rulers. He's going to talk about the wickedness and things that you're going to be confused about, the symbols and stuff. But don't lose sight of the outcome of what he's trying to say. Let me give you an example. And really, I suppose if you wanted to come up with a theme, if you're trying to understand what a theme passage would be, take a look over in Revelation chapter 2. So chapter 2, and I'm going to begin in verse 8, but actually it's down here in verses 10 through 11. And the angel of the church in Smyrna write, the first and the last, who was dead and has come to life, says this, I know your tribulation and your poverty, but you are rich, and the blasphemy by those who say they are Jews and are not, but are the synagogue of Satan. Do not fear what you are about to suffer. Behold, the devil is about to cast some of you into prison, so that you will be tested, and you will have tribulation for 10 days. Be faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. He who overcomes will not be hurt by the second death. So that statement in itself is something that's given to all the churches. Now, it's written right after this reference to Smyrna, but it's to the churches. And what he's telling everybody is that the church is going to face persecution. Satan is going to come after you, and he's going to use the governing authorities to do it. You be faithful until death, and you'll get the crown of life. You will be victorious. Don't give up on your faith facing all of this persecution. So when you're reading through this, don't lose sight, because that is the message of hope for every Christian in every generation. There are going to be times when, as nations, the government authorities, they're going to try to destroy the church. We live in such a time. Now, they're not as vocal and physical about it as the time of Domitian, but I don't think we're too far from politicians requiring deity worship. They see themselves in a very elevated position. They see themselves in a position that you religious people are a bunch of idiots anyway. So, and the persecution is there. It can get worse. So whatever time period you live in, remember that message. Your victory is sure because Christ has been victorious over death. If he was victorious over death, so will you be no matter what happens. All right, Travis first.
And it's getting worse.
Yes, and it's getting worse. Yeah. Sonny?
You know, this last year that we went through, we didn't have a lot of it here, but those places in the United States where they were really
Yeah, yeah.
churches.
Michigan is like one of the worst places that you heard about.
And then
California.
on, we were watching Fox News the other night, and there was some things about they've got nativity scenes with people wearing masks in the nativity scenes. You know, the nativity scene itself is not right, you know, but anyhow.
But hey, at least they're wearing masks.
And then this woman is saying that the vaccine is something to be worshipped because it came from God.
I've heard that. I've actually heard that before.
Yeah, so we're living in some pretty crazy times, and if we get the right nut up there in office.
I tell you what, one thing that was interesting to me was to see, I saw an advertising the other day where there was some preacher in some church. It could be an actor portrayal, one of those things. But he was, and I don't think it was, I think it was a real preacher in some church. And he was talking about the most godly thing, Christian thing you could do is to go out and get this vaccine. That's the most, and I thought to myself, whoa. Why do you all of a sudden forget about the separation of the church and state when it's to your convenience? Now you want to use the church as a weapon against people? But as soon as that, you're done with using this fool who's going to come out there and say that, now that you're going to wipe your hands of him because he thought what are you going to do to him next? I'm just like, yeah, they will use these things for their purpose. And now we're hearing of the firing of employees and stuff like that. Okay, those aren't even Christian people. Those are just people who don't want to get the vaccine and they're losing their jobs. If they're going to do that to just actually people who probably voted for them, who are they not going to do it to, Pat?
I was just thinking of the legislation that's being done these days and the idea that the homosexual agenda is being forced
Abortion is
on
just,
everybody,
yeah,
and that preachers are going to get thrown in jail for not,
Yeah.
Making a wedding ceremony for a homosexual couple because
yeah.
you don't believe.
If you don't do it, you're going to lose your business,
Yeah,
right? You're going to lose your business, yeah.
That's the government coming in and telling you.
Right. So we see those type of things. And again, we're not at the point where, they've come to us and said, I mean, maybe not flat out, you need to do what we tell you to do because we're God. Although I think some people have elevated scientists to that category. They see scientists as gods. They have all the answers. They know everything. I saw this beautiful post the other day, and I've always argued this myself. I'm like, okay, let's just go down the list. This is one argument. I love this guy. I read this book. It's called the Devil's Delusion, and the guy was arguing how wonderful science was. And he goes, okay, well, let's go down the list of things that science has done. They created the atomic bomb. They created mustard gas. They created chlorine gas. He started going through all the things that these great scientists have created that just wipe out civilization. He goes, so these great moral men, they are destroying. If you take a look at, then somebody went through and said, hey, look at all these things that they said was okay. Remember when the doctors used to advertise smoking was good for you? Thalidomide, you should be taking it, right? All these, and I'm like, stop elevating these people to a status of God. They're not. They're just people. Hey, I'm in support of science and honest scientists, but let's not make them something that they're not.
They
Son.
used to slice people's wrists to get that bad old blood out of them.
Yes, yeah. Let's do some bloodletting, put some leeches on.
Yeah, and now it's
Yeah.
scientific.
Yeah, that was science back then. Yeah. The book of Revelation reveals the ultimate triumph of good over evil, truth over error, the persecuted over the persecutors, and Christ over Satan. So it's a book of hope. It's a message of hope in the Revelation. The key word in Revelation is overcome. Christians are on the winning team. The Christian will eventually triumph over darkness. Over darkness. Triumph over Wi-Fi. Satan is trying to stop it here. I know it. The Christian will eventually triumph over the world. The churches of Christ are undergoing the most severe persecution they had known up to this time. Jesus had foretold that the world would hate his disciples. John 15, 18 through 20. If they hate me, they'll also hate you. If they persecute me, they'll also persecute you. Paul had warned of persecution because of the word of God. That was constantly on their mind. The Apostle John had been exiled to Patmos. There's persecution, right? He's been exiled there. Patmos is a rocky island 4 miles off the shore of Asia Minor and 70 miles southwest of Ephesus. It's about 50 square miles in size. Political prisoners were usually sent here to work in the salt mines. Why was he sent there? Because he was preaching the gospel. He wasn't a murderer. He wasn't a criminal. He was preaching the gospel. The purpose of Revelation was to encourage the suffering saints by showing that God was on his throne and therefore his people would prevail over their persecutors. Revelation was written in symbols. He sent and signified it 1:1. The symbols would be understood by the Christians, but they would not be understood by the Roman persecutors. Revelation belongs to a type of literature called apocalyptic. It's highly figurative type of writing. Is often used during times of persecution. Parts of the Old Testament books of Ezekiel, Daniel, and Zechariah were written in apocalyptic language, and there's references to those books in the Revelation. Apocalyptic writing flourished between 200 BC and 280. All right, and I think that's where we're going to stop right there, yeah. All right, we're going to stop right there. So we'll finish up next week. We're going to get into the outline, a couple of different outlines here, and then we're going to look at some lessons that we can take from the Revelation. Again, the thing here is not to go into every facet of the Revelation, but just to give us a general view of what's taking place here. And I suppose the main points are, remember it's figurative language. Remember the main thrust of the book is that even though Christians are being persecuted, that they are going to be victorious. Keep those things in mind, and as you're studying the book, don't let it overwhelm you with all the symbolism, and just use the tools that are available to find out what do those numbers stand for, what do these symbols represent, and be logical in your approach. I think it's completely illogical to take the book of Revelation and shove it all the way down the road and say, oh, these are missiles, and this is this, and this is it just completely messes up the message that's being given there, because they want to keep making it, because the core message lives throughout the ages. It lives throughout you don't have to have all those things taking place 2,000, this year or maybe next year or 10 years or 1,000 years from now. You don't have to have all those things taking place down there, because the message is these people are being persecuted. They're being informed where the persecution is coming from, and they're being told they will be victorious. When you've got that message, it doesn't matter what age you live in, when you're being persecuted, remember, you will be victorious. And that is applicable to every Christian throughout the ages until the Lord returns. Who had their hand up? Sonny.
It doesn't teach anything that the rest of the Bible teaches.
Yeah.
There's nothing
Yeah.
to it.
Well, when you go through and you're looking at the Gospel of John, you're certainly going to see the deity of Christ, the victory, the persecution that's taking place. I mean, all that Jesus went through was the persecution at the hand of the Jews. But then after that, we see persecution begin to take place. Paul even talked about that they were going to face. And I think a core message, if you take a look at it, here's a question for you. It's a trick question. When was the first time someone tried to persecute Jesus? And think about this.
When he was a baby.
When he was 2 years old. 2 years in that frame, yeah. And when did it stop? Okay, and so when did they stop persecuting the Christians after his death? They didn't. It never stopped. It won't stop. I mean, just get it in your heads that Christians will be persecuted. Now, I'm not talking about being the same thing at the same level, but there's always going to be a non-acceptance of Christianity by the world in general. They're not going to accept it. They didn't accept this infant, trying to kill him. He goes to the cross and the church is persecuted. The Jews did it. And when the destruction of Jerusalem happened, the Romans took up the mantle and they began to do it. And it's been that way. And look, when's the next great persecution of the Christians? After Domitian, you know when it was? The Catholic Church. Because they're the next body that comes in that has controlling power and now begins to control what you will believe, practice. You go back and look at the history of the Catholic Church, how brutal they were. You thought the Pharisees were bad? Oh my word. These guys, they make the Pharisees look like kittens. So they begin to control, dictate, persecute. Don't do what we tell you to do. You know, like the Jews, we're going to kick you out of the synagogue. We're going to excommunicate you. So for some, yeah, it's always been there.